clarification to you, and that is this. Number one, recognizing this is an ESP board relationship series, we want to, of course, maintain the fidelity of that topic. But I also want you to understand that when we talk about some of what we're going to discuss this evening in services transitions, the principles and best practices that I'm going to share with you can really be applied to any of your existing contracts and services relationships. So understand that we're not just going to be talking about ESP boards specifically tonight. Obviously, that is going to be a good part of the discussion, but I also want you to understand that I hope you can see the transferability with your contracts, existing contracts, and what we're going to cover this evening. And then I also want to share with you that in no way should this session appear to demonstrate any kind of encouragement, mandate, support, anything that looks as though either I or Lake Superior State University is in any way encouraging or mandating or supporting, as I just said, any kind of services transition. This session is being brought to you this evening to help you think about if there is ever a need to transition services, to transition contracts, how to do that in the most seamless, least disruptive way possible, disruptive to your environment and to your educational climate at the school. So that is the intent of this session. So please understand that as we move forward as well. So just wanted to make those clarifications for you this evening. And while I talk about what I'm going to cover briefly, give you a little session preview, I'm going to leave this screen up. You know, this is my standard screen that I love to show during the webinar series. I was thinking this evening as I was doing some final preparation for tonight, when I worked for the National Charter Schools Institute, which most of you know that I was there for a number of years, when we had meetings with our board, one of our board members, our board president, before every meeting would write kids on the whiteboard, because he always wanted us to stay focused throughout the conversation and through our work on what is mattering to us the most and why we do what we do in this world of education, and that is the children, the kids. So this is my parallel to the kids relative to these webinar sessions that we've been bringing to you. This is to help you always understand that in any situation, you have the authority to make decisions on behalf of the school and the responsibility, and especially tonight as we're looking at services transition. So I'm going to keep this up here while I just preview with you a couple of quick thoughts for this evening's session. So what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to review with you, are 5 best practices that you can employ if and when the timing is right in making those services transitions. And within the context of those best practices, much like the last session, I've embedded some hyperlinks. So I'm going to be sharing with you what I hope to be helpful documents and tools that you might want to keep on file as you move forward in your governance work, and just pull out and review and think about in both your existing work as well as when you're ready to make, if you are ever ready to make those services transitions. So there'll be some back and forth with screen, so please bear with me as you did the last time we were together as we manipulate the screen in front of you this evening. So let's just move forward and start working through these best practices. So best practice number 1, when and if you're considering making services transitions, is, as you probably would have guessed, because we've been talking a lot about this through this series, understanding your contract or agreement. So for purposes of our discussion this evening, I'm just going to say contract or contracts. You'll understand what that means as we progress through the conversation tonight. So understanding your contract or contracts. And that's important really for three primary purposes. Number one, as I've mentioned, and I think as I mentioned during our evaluation session a couple of weeks ago, it's just good practice, obviously, to become intimately familiar with all of your contracts that you have with all of your vendors, right? But I think, again, when we're looking at a services transition, there's really some specific critical language that you're going to want to give some extra attention and time. So I've highlighted those on the screen for you this evening. So to the left, we'll start there, notification language. So in most of your contracts, you're going to likely have some language that speaks to the notification provisions should either party desire to terminate the contract. So particularly with an ESP contract, you're going to find likely two types of notification provisions. One is general notification provisions. So what is required of me as the board should I want to terminate this contract, this relationship? What kind of timing should I be thinking about in terms of making the notice to the provider? How might I consider making that notice? Are the requirements in the agreement that speak to that? Is it verbal? Is it written? Etc. So you want to be mindful of that. But you also want to be mindful of the second piece of the notification, and that is the material breach language. So particularly in an ESP contract, there should be some language that speaks to if your provider is in material breach of your contract, there's a remedy period. And in most cases, I think it's a 90-day remedy period. So if there's something that the provider has intentionally done to compromise your contract with them and or your contract with your authorizer, think about that material breach language. And I think that's particularly important if you're looking at transitioning services, and if you're looking at transitioning services because of something that went awry in the relationship. So you want to be sure you're looking at that material breach language first, if indeed it is included in your contract, doing what's required of you relative to a material breach situation, certainly satisfying any of those requirements to remedy that breach, and then moving forward in whatever way, shape, or form is necessary with that contractual relationship. So hope that makes sense to you. And then from there, we'll go to the bottom right corner, termination language. All of your contracts with your ESPs and probably with other vendors as well should include some termination language. The termination language, particularly with your ESP, is a whole section. Each of you in your relative and respective ESP agreements should have a section dedicated to termination. So what you really need to pay particular attention to here in the termination language is, again, what are the obligations relative to the termination? What's the term? End date, right? So in most situations, in the majority of situations, your lease agreement, your ESP agreement, and your charter performance contract are all going to expire on the same date. Those are coterminous relationships, contractual relationships. So the termination date should be whatever your charter performance contract date is. But in addition to that, when you look at that termination language, you're also going to want to pay attention to transition language. So are there any provisions within the termination section that speaks to the ESP's role in transitioning management services, for example? So are they obligated through the contract to be supportive in those efforts? Are there any proprietary provisions relative to the resources that the ESP has brought to the academy, and what does that language look like? And I think that's particularly important in this section when we're talking about personal property, right? So if you, the academy board, is leasing any kind of personal property from the ESP, are there any provisions or any language that speaks to the academy board's right to purchase any of the those personal properties. And then certainly what is the financial obligations you're under relative to a termination. So some of the ESP agreements, for example, might include some financial obligation language that suggests you as the Academy Board, for example, must pay out the existing contract. Or if there are outstanding payments for services, you at a minimum will be required to satisfy those financial obligations. So again, just be mindful of that. And then be mindful of the general language that speaks to termination by the Academy Board and then termination by the educational service provider, and what that might look like. So just those two areas and thoughts to be mindful of as you move the relationship forward. And then finally, that services language. It's going to be important for you. By now, hopefully, you have understood the services that are to be provided by your service provider. However, it would still behoove you in any transition situation to review that services language, because what you're going to want to assess, and we're going to talk about a needs analysis in one of our best practices here in a couple of slides, but what you're going to want to assess is what's currently being provided to us. Is that a service that, number one, we're satisfied with? And then is it a service that we want to continue as we look at or pursue alternative arrangements with potentially alternative vendors? So really important to understand that services language. And again, like the personal property conversation we had relative to termination language, here too, you're going to want to look at any of the proprietary items, materials, supplies that the provider has brought to the Academy, and be certain that you understand the nature of that proprietary material. And because it's proprietary, it's likely going to leave the school when the provider leaves the school. So you'll just want to consider that as you look at making some decisions relative to alternative services. So I'm just going to, again, stop for a minute. And I'm going to stop a few times through this session because I think this is just a critical enough conversation that it's going to engender maybe some more questions, thoughts, comments than what we've experienced in the past. So I want to certainly invite those. So I'm going to stop here, allow you time to just think about what I share, think about your own relationships, and then ask any questions. Remember, while I said ESP in this conversation, this is true with all your contracts, and all of the contracts that you have with all of your vendors. You're going to want to look at all of this language as well: the notification language, termination language, and services language, so you can make some informed decisions moving forward. So I do have a question, a couple of questions here. One is, what if this school is self-managed and there is no ESP? Good question. So it's, I think we are operating in a world now where I feel like most of the schools are managed. However, if you're not, chances are, so when I say ESP, right, I'm thinking full provider of services. But the reality is that even if you don't have an ESP, a full provider of services, perhaps you're contracting out for portions of those administrative functions. I don't know, but perhaps you've got someone who's managing your financial obligations on your behalf, or your compliance obligations on your behalf, or your just general operations functions on your behalf. If you do, then you likely have some kind of written contractual relationship with them as well. So just think about these same concepts relative to that relationship and apply what you can accordingly. If you are fully self-managed and all you rely on is a school leader to perform these services, same same concept. I mean, if you're looking at transitioning school leadership, I think there should be some kind of an agreement or contract in place with that school leader. Call it an agreement, maybe that's what it is. Certainly review that as you're making leadership transitions, and ask these same questions. What is our obligation to notify the school leader? Now, in most cases, we know that employees are at-will employees in our charter environment. However, you still have a responsibility to notify accordingly. What does the termination language look like in those agreements and those arrangements? And then what services is that school leader providing currently that we need to think about in maybe a successor school leader? So I hope that helps answer that question. So you just kind of have to use your sort of creative minds as we move forward. If you don't have a full ESP, or if you have contracted out other services. So I'll continue to emphasize that as we move forward. So thank you for that question. Yeah, and then I think this is a continuation. Should there still be some kind of service language related to the management team and how to deal with a separation? I think so. I think you should always, I mean, in an ideal world, we will never experience the need to separate from a provider, right? Or a school leader or administrator. But it's still in the board's best interest to prepare for that should and if it were to happen. So I think that it's just a proactive measure that a board should take and be prepared to engage and implement if indeed there's some kind of relationship change. So if there is separation language currently not in your agreement with a partial provider or school leadership, maybe this session will help encourage you to add some language or develop some language that speaks to that. And you also might have policy language that speaks to that as well. So, be sure to review those policies as I continue to emphasize in these sessions, and just see if there's anything there that might help effectuate any kind of seamless legal transition. So hopefully that answered the question. So good. Okay. So that was best practice number one, is again, just ensuring you understand the contracts or the agreements that you have with vendors, with providers. Best practice number two is going to speak to communication. So, and this is to really ensure there's open, transparent communication throughout the process, from the time you're thinking about making those transition decisions to the time you actually finalize a new relationship with a new provider. So that communication is obviously very important to me. We did a whole session on it. Remember last year, one of our webinars focused on effective communication. And during that session, I identified or defined effective communication as sharing with the right people the right information at the right time, right? And when I delivered that session, one of the first slides I shared with you with respect to the right people was this slide. So we had, if you remember correctly, we had a primary network and we had a secondary network. And each one of those networks, just like this one does, had certain circles of people or groups of people surrounding it. So when we talk about open communication in a transition situation, your primary network should be engaged and involved to a certain extent. And to what extent depends on the role with the school environment, right? So certainly at the top of our primary network is the authorizer. So when you're making any kind of vendor transition, particularly an ESP transition, you want to be certain that your authorizer is informed. It's just communication courtesy, right? To keep your authorizer informed of those changes that are being made within the context of your board contractual board vendor relationship. And it's crucial when you're making any kind of ESP transition because most authorizers have policies that speak to what the relationship should look like. And then some authorizers include those ESP agreements in the charter contracts. So if indeed the ESP agreement is part of the charter contract and you're making changes in your ESP prior to a reauthorization situation, then you need to certainly communicate with your authorizer because that could require a contract amendment. And obviously, the authorizer needs to be engaged from a policy perspective as well. So be certain that your authorizer is well informed. Now, does your authorizer need to know and understand every vendor change? I'm not sure. That's something that you would want to discuss with, for example, Lake Superior State University specifically. I can't imagine that they would want to know everyone. I think as they continue to review things like your financials and your compliance documents, it might be helpful so they understand what budget impact that transition has had on the school board's budget as they're looking at those financial documents, for example. So if you haven't asked Lake Superior State University that question of how informed they need to be on those vendor relationships, it might be a good question to ask at some point. But regardless, in an ESP transition, you certainly want to be sure the authorizer is in the know. School staff, absolutely. School staff is going to be affected by services transitions, particularly an ESP transition. But I would say to you, and I don't know if we always think about keeping our school staff informed on just general vendor transitions. I think it's a good practice, particularly where those vendors are in and out of the school building on some kind of regular basis. You want your school staff to know and understand who's entering and exiting the building. So if they're not informed and one day they see some new unfamiliar face wandering through the halls, they're going to be a little suspicious. And in this era of heightened safety and security, it's just a good practice, I think, to help them understand when they're going to see new faces entering the building through these services transition changes. So keep that in mind as you think about any kinds of transitions that you're making. And then certainly in an ESP situation, when there's transition there, you're going to want to inform your school staff at some point. Now, timing relative to school staff communication is going to be really critical. And the next slide is a hyperlink, and I'm going to share with you a sample communications plan. And in that sample communications plan, we address some timing considerations of communicating with school staff on those changes. It's highly sensitive. You know that. You don't want to unnecessarily scare your staff, but you also want to keep them informed of what's happening at the school level in a transparent way. So that can be, I get that, a little challenging. So we'll talk about that momentarily. Your school families, to the extent, again, that your school families are impacted by these changes, you're going to want to inform them. I think this is, again, similar to school staff. If you have school families, if you have parents who are spending a lot of time at the school and they've become familiar with some of your vendors and their practices in terms of entering and exiting the building, as we just talked about, I think it would be good for them to understand as well these changes. So again, this is safety, security kinds of considerations, right? And then as you're making changes in your major provider, your ESP, certainly going to want to engage them as appropriate in any kinds of meetings, forums, discussions relative to those changes. Legal counsel, how you involve legal counsel in general contract vendor transitions is entirely at your discretion. Obviously, You don't want to get them too deeply engaged in all of those conversations and considerations because that can get costly. We all understand that. At a minimum, you might want to have your legal counsel review your contracts to ensure they contain the information necessary to protect the board and preserve some of its authority in those relationships. So I'll share with you, I work with several schools and school boards, and I enter into professional services agreements with them. And a board that I've worked with in Lansing for a number of years, we've just renewed the professional services agreement last summer. And one of the board members asked if my agreement underwent legal review before the board signed it. So I think it's a good practice. Again, exercise judgment and ensure financial stewardship as you do that. Now, certainly in an ESP situation, legal counsel will have to get involved because it's likely that if indeed Lake Superior State University has ESP policies, that they're going to require at some point the legal counsel to opine that the agreement, the new agreement being negotiated or considered for execution is in compliance with those ESP policies. So obviously the legal counsel, your legal counsel will need to get involved in those kinds of transitions, in those ESP transitions. Michigan Department of Ed, to the extent that services transitions impact the charter contract, they will be informed. Typically, the information passes from the authorizer to the Michigan Department of Ed because you probably know this, but as just a reminder, the Michigan Department of Ed holds the exact copy of the charter contract that your authorizer holds and that hopefully you hold somewhere within the realm of your educational world. And at all times, those contracts should be identical. So if there's any kind of service transition that impacts the charter contract, as we just stated, depending on the timing, that might require a charter contract amendment by your authorizer. Once that amendment is executed, then it's incumbent upon the authorizer to ensure the department has what it needs to maintain that exact identity to the charter contract in its file. So MDE to the extent it affects the contract. And then obviously the vendor with whom you're having conversation with respect to those services transitions. So I know this, it's not easy. It's a bit of a breakup, right? Sometimes in these vendor situations, and breakups are never easy, but it's really necessary. And, I've seen situations where communication just hasn't been open enough, and that creates all kinds of challenges in the relationship, and then ultimately it creates all kinds of challenges with the educational environment, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid, which is why I'm bringing you these best practices this evening. So if you feel there's any kind of challenge in the relationship, if there's any hint of making any kind of services transition with any of your existing vendors, I would say start having those conversations with them immediately. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe there's something that the vendor thinks it's supposed to be doing that you don't think it's supposed to be doing, and maybe just a conversation can help resolve some of these issues, which would be ideal, which is why it's important to just maintain that sense of open communication, but even more when the situations warrant some potential critical implications. So just keep that in mind. So that essentially, as you're looking at services transitions, is your, sort of primary network for communicating. Now, you'll remember when I delivered the communication session last year in the secondary network, we had groups like local school districts, your local RESAs or intermediate school districts. I think I had law enforcement on there. So those groups, again, you refer to those, certainly in any of those secondary networks that you feel need to know what's happening for whatever reason. Use your own judgment, exercise your own judgment. But for purposes of our conversation tonight, I wanted to be sure you understood that this group will in some way be impacted by those services transitions. So they're the key group for this evening's conversation. So as I mentioned, I just want to share with you a sample communications plan relative to these services transitions. Now I'll say to you, and I think we might have talked about this last year in the communication session. If you don't have any kind of communications plan in place to date, I would encourage you to develop one. Now, this is specific to a transition scenario. I do have what I think is a really helpful, more simplified communications template, and it's one that is cross-section to a legend that you can use to just help identify things like what services warrant some kind of attention, who the spokesperson or spokespeople will be for that particular scenario, what's the urgency of communicating if indeed this kind of scenario surfaces. So that's just a basic sort of fill in the letter template. If any of you would like to see a copy of that, please don't hesitate to email me. I'd be happy to share it with you. So ideally, you would use that, and then you would get to something like this that's a little more extensive and comprehensive than the sort of fill in the section and the square piece, but still, I think very helpful. So in a communications plan, for this kind of transition. And what this is encouraging you to do is to really think through some key pieces of your communications efforts when you're making these transitions. So this communications plan is divided into 6 sections. Number 1, general information about the academy, which you see before you. The second section is communications purpose. So what is our purpose for communicating? The third section is parties of interest. We just talked about that. The fourth section is who is going to be our spokesperson. The fifth section is how are we going to communicate this out? So what's our communications vehicle? And then finally, what's that communications content going to look like? So I'm not going to go through each of these sections with you ad nauseum, but I will just kind of highlight some key pieces within them. So as I said, general information about the academy and its services. So current services, what it desires, etc. And then you get down to where notably starts, that talks about what you desire in an ESP vendor relationship, right? All the way down to the Academy Board is interested in reviewing its future vendor options. So then we get to the communications purpose. So when you're making services transitions, I submit to you that you probably have roughly 5 purposes that you're going to want to convey. So I am going to read this to you because I think these are important pieces. Number 1, to ensure general awareness and transparency in the Academy Board's decision regarding vendors and the process used to inform new vendors. So open, transparent process from the beginning to the end. To educate the general public on the charter school strategy and its accountability structure. So this is just sharing, in the context of your messaging, being able to share some general structural information with your school community as warranted, as necessary. The third bullet is to demonstrate the Academy Board's proactive approach in communicating with all stakeholders. Fourth bullet, to alleviate concerns and dispel myths and misconceptions about the Academy and its future. future. And then finally, to articulate the Academy Board's commitment to students and student achievement, as well as its commitment to its strategic goal of, this is language that I worked on through this template with a group, and their goal was to become a high-ranking public school nationally and internationally. So ideally, the fifth bullet is you want to ensure that your community understands that first and foremost you're committed to students and to student achievement, as well as your own strategic goals that you've put into place at the school level. So we talk here about parties of interest. So highlighting a few pieces in here, you want to, with any party of interest, and when I say parties of interest here, I'm using that term collectively, so that's going to be your primary and secondary networks. So what you want to be certain of here is that you're articulating that the future of the Academy remains stable, that the Academy Board, it's all right here, that the Academy Board's decision to review its vendor options is about ensuring students and families are receiving the educational experience they deserve, and that the Academy Board has both the authority and the responsibility to protect and preserve the educational environment of the students it serves. So I think three really important pieces, again, that you are going to want to articulate to those that are interested in what you're trying to accomplish in your decision making. So moving down to communication spokesperson or spokespeople. So you're going to want to appoint someone to really speak on behalf of the Academy Board, because, you know, this might seem a little over the top to you and maybe a little silly, but I've been in situations where I've been amazed at the interest of these changes by outside people. It's just amazing. So I think you should never under assume the role of your community in these transitions, but over assume and be prepared to address all questions in all situations. So be certain that in these transition efforts that you appoint a person. Typically that's going to be your board president. And I always encourage, again, in the spirit of transparency and open communication, that there's formal action taken, appointing the board president to function in that spokesperson capacity. And then once you get into, you know, the whole RFP process, you're probably going to want to at some point engage your legal counsel, especially if there's questions relative to the process, the efficacy of the process, the fidelity of the process. You might want to consider, again, using your attorney or legal counsel to address those questions. Communication vehicles, as I said, how are you going to communicate? You can do that, you know, a number of ways, and I offer a few suggestions there. Communication content. So your communications content is embedded within each one of these critical parties. So I think, again, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but at your leisure, and I will send this to you. In fact, maybe I'll just send it to all of you after the webinar this evening, because I think there are just some good general messages embedded in here that you might just want to be sharing, even on a regular basis with your school community. But what this section is attempting to do is shaping messages relative to the party affected. So you'll see current vendor. How do we want to address our current vendor? What do we want to say to them? How do we want to message this? Staff, same thing. How do we want to message this? And this is where, remember, I talked about in this, you're going to think about timing. So we're saying here, so it may be in the board's best interest to engage staff in forums. It's right here where they can provide input and feedback before and during the RFP process. It is recommended that these forums begin following the public action taken by the Academy Board on initiating the RFP process in blank and blank. So timing considerations there. So that's where that's included. And again, students and families, what do you want to say to them? How do you want to engage them? Should there be a need to do that? And then your authorizer, again, communicating with the authorizer authorizer, we mentioned how important that is. The MDE is referenced in here as well. And then I talk about, just generally speaking, if there are people out there who are just generally interested in the decisions that you're making, here's some language that you might want to consider in communicating with those folks as well. So again, just a way to address consistently, I think is key here too, a consistent message. And by documenting how you're going to approach this from a communications perspective is the best way also to ensure consistency in your messaging. So just a piece that I wanted to share with you this evening in the spirit of our conversations. So that's the sample communications plan. I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to encourage additional questions, comments before I move on to the next best practice. So feel free to just think about what you've heard. And again, that was best practice number 2, which was ensuring open communications. Mm-hmm. So one thing I didn't share with you, and I apologize, I'm Jenny Peterman with the Lake Superior State University Charter Schools offices on the line, and Jenny just reminded me that they will post the template on their website with the webinar in the PowerPoint. So just know that that'll be out there on the website as well, just as a standalone, and then there'll be with the webinar with the recording. So if no questions here, and again, just this is not your last opportunity. I just want to continue to pause and invite questions. We'll move on with best practice number 3, which is really about needs analysis. It's important from my perspective that you understand not just what your needs currently are, but what your needs may be in a new relationship, whatever, again, that new relationship will look like from a contract board perspective. So I'm going to just share with you, I think, what is a good way to think about a needs analysis. So remember, a needs analysis, that's really its purpose is to help determine gaps that are in existence or may be preventing you from reaching your desired goals, right? So that's really kind of the purpose of the needs analysis and knowing what is working well and what needs to be changed. And this is a perfect time as you're making some of the service transitions to really explore that more deeply. So here's just kind of a needs analysis process that you might want to consider undertaking as you are preparing to think about making any services transition. So you see right in the middle, what do we have? Evaluations. So another way that evaluations can prove informative and helpful in your role as governors of the schools over which you're governing, and that is making informed decisions about the performance of your vendors, right? So if you've been administering evaluation, some form of evaluation, obviously doesn't have to be as extensive as what we talked about when we gathered a couple of weeks ago. Use those evaluations to help you really determine and discern whether or not it's time to make a services transition. Okay, so use those to help you inform that. So I have a hyperlink here. It really just takes us to that evaluation instrument that I showed you last week, so I won't bore you with showing you that again. I think though what I will say, actually I take that back. You know what? I am going to bring it up because what I want to point out to you is that last section of the evaluation that we touched upon during our last session, which actually addresses the key areas for improvement. It's that action plan. So I'm going to just zip right through this. Hopefully I'm not making all of you dizzy as I advance quickly through these pages and through these sections, because what I want to point out is I think this is going to be key to some of your decision making. So if you've done an evaluation of your providers and you have reached some decisions about what needs attention for future improvements, and then you've documented that, you're assessing then the next evaluation period on improvements in those areas, and you're not seeing any, and you see a repeated pattern there, this might be a good indication that it's time to make a service change. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, because again, I think another way to just help you discern the need, but also documented support for the decision that you could be making. And again, whether it's a full service provider decision or whether it's a single a la carte vendor change, something like this could be helpful in informing what that action might look like. So use that. I would also encourage you to prepare some kind of performance gaps analysis. And this is really done with the intention of helping you think about, just as I said, like the whole needs analysis is, right? But really getting specific into those services to help you really think about, okay, this is what the current relationship consists of. These are the services that are being provided. This is where we have seen gaps historically. As a result of these gaps, these are our new requirements for a relationship with a vendor or with a provider. So what this performance gap analysis allows you to do is it allows you to kind of list out what those services are. So that's the first section. If there's any additional sort of extraneous services that perhaps the board is assuming responsibility for, you want to list those too. So this is really designed to outline the sort of whole bucket of services that as a board you're contracting out for, whatever those might look like. But this then is where you're going to look at, just as I said, those services. You're going to say, okay, this service A, B, C, list those services. Really think about, okay, where have we identified those gaps? Why are we even here making this kind of decision or thinking about making this kind of decision? There's obviously been some discrepancies between the services promised and the outcomes achieved. So what do those identified gaps look like? And then again, just as I said, based on that, what are our new requirements? What do we want to see in our next relationship, right? What are we going to require? What are we really going to think about here? So this just allows you to, again, document those concerns in a formal way through this performance analysis. But what I also want you to think about is what are those, remember we talked about this when we talked about the contract, the best practice number one, knowing the contract. What are those proprietary systems and materials that if there is a change, we're going to lose? So you're going to want to list those out, because then the next decision you're going to have to make is, do we want to assume those then as a board in our new relationship, or do we want to rely on the vendor to satisfy those services in some way? And then that gets to the next section, which is really about those subcontracted services. So if you have a full provider of services and that contract with that provider allows the provider to subcontract for other operational services, maybe like maintenance or janitorial, like special education services, like assessment services, anything that might be outside of the direct contractual relationship with the ESP, you're also going to want to talk about those, and then how you're going to want to assume those in the future, either through your own contractual responsibilities, or again, allowing the new vendor to negotiate those contracts. So another piece for you to just think about and to document as you're starting to make those service transition decisions. And again, if you want a copy of this, don't hesitate to email me for that. So again, the evaluations of performance gaps, they're going to inform what those new requirements might be or what you would like them to be in your relationship. And then certainly what process, as you look at your whole needs analysis, what process are you going to undertake to meet those requirements? And in this case, in most cases, it's going to be an RFP process. And then what stakeholders are going to be most affected or most engaged in this process. So when you look at the needs analysis, you really want to consider, in my opinion, all four of these components, because I think they're just helpful in allowing you to make those future decisions. So that's the needs analysis piece. So again, I'll stop there and allow questions and answer them accordingly. So one of the questions that came in was, how would you go about identifying those gaps? If you are not in the school, then you have to rely on the ESP school leader to report out. Wouldn't it be in their best interest to report out something that is favorable to them? Yes, of course it would be in their best interest to report out what's favorable to them, but it's also in your board's best interest to ask wise questions to get responses that are realistic and certainly aligned with your thinking about what's happening at your school. So you hopefully have some kind of, remember we talked about this at the last session, that assurance reporting. So from this point forward, hopefully what you're going to do is develop some kind of monthly reporting tool that has, what's expected, what's going to be reported on, what those expected outcomes are going to look like. All those things we talked about during our last session together. But in the absence of that, I understand the question. I understand this is a difficult scenario because you don't always know what those performance gaps are, at least from the report, but you should know from the data. You should know based on the data where certainly the academic gaps are, where the financial gaps might be. If there, remember some of those things we talked about the last time, if there are behavioral issues, cultural issues, what are those looking like, and what are those gaps based on what we expect and what's happening, and again, what are our new requirements in a provider. So at a minimum, rely on the data that you have before you, rely on those outcomes based materials that are hopefully getting to you somehow, if not through your ESP, through your authorizer. Right? So whatever you have in your possession that can help you identify whether or not your existing provider is performing, use it, is what I'm suggesting. But I would also encourage you, just as we talked about in our last session, to develop your own tools as well that really forces that honest conversation from your ESP to your board. So hopefully that helps in answering that question. So good. Okay, so that's our needs analysis. That was best practice number 3. So we've got 2 more to get through, and I think we're going to do it over the next half hour. Best practice number 4, which is now you've reviewed your contract, you understand the language, you've ensured open communication, you've done your needs analysis. Now you're either going to develop or review your process for transitioning those services. So if you don't have a process in place for thinking about making those services transitions, then I'm going to offer just a very simple process to you this evening. So think about something as simple as this, a four-part process that starts with project planning, and our project is pursuing new contractual relationships, right? It's not just an RFP, or it's not just what the next boxes suggest, drafting the RFP or issuing the RFP, but the project is pursuing new contractual relationship. So you want to plan for that. So you want to engage in some project planning. You want to then draft the RFP. You want to issue the RFP. You want to review the proposals and award the contract. So four pretty simple steps as you think about developing or reviewing a services transition process. So that's develop, review the process. If you have a process in place, I would certainly encourage you to review it, and even review it if you're not in the business of making a change. It's always a good practice to review all of your processes on some kind of frequency, right? So even if you have a process in place, still review it. If you don't, consider something as simple as this. So the next best practice then is to implement the process with fidelity. So now we're going to take each one of those boxes, and I'm going to give you some suggestions on how you might want to think about those elements relative to implementation. So implement process with fidelity. And I say fidelity for this reason. Number one, you're going to have people watching you, right? You're a public body and you operate in a public format. So you're going to have people watching you. And if you're ending a relationship with a vendor on not so positive terms, you bet they're going to be watching, and they're going to be ensuring that if indeed you have a process in place, you are following it to the T. So understand that it's important to implement, not just implement, but implement with fidelity. So we're now going to walk through each one of those components. So project planning, that was the first box of our process. So what do you want to think about when you're sitting down, when you're thinking, okay, we've got this process in place, we now need to think about really effectuating this process. So the first piece that you're going to think about are the requirements. What kind of requirements are we looking at for this project? When I say requirements, I'm talking about time, I'm talking about money, I'm talking about, do we need a contractor involved in this process? Do we need people? What people? So communication requirements, what do those look like? So just mapping out all those requirements as part of the project, being sensitive to what those look like. And then secondly, scope of services. So what are the scope of services in our project planning? So we now know, based on our needs analysis, that we've got some services that we're going to be looking at, services that we're going to be requiring in our new relationship, right? So let's list those out now in our project planning phase of the process. We want to be certain that any new vendor, and again, whether it's a full service provider or again, I'll say a la carte vendor, is aligned with our vision, is aligned with our mission, and is aligned with our values, right? And this is really important, in my opinion. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are just trying to do business with people, right? That aren't doing business with people because they're attracted to what you're trying to accomplish from a vision, mission, values perspective. So be certain that any new vendor that you're pursuing is aligned with these three components, and you're going to get to some of that through the RFP process, and then certainly through any follow-up face-to-face interviews that you have. In your project planning, you're going to look at your range of vendors. So if we're looking at just, changing the, financial contractor, who's out there that can do this? So if we're looking at changing maintenance, who's out there that can do this? So really be sure you have a handle on the range of vendors. What's your budget? I don't know that there's a lot of time typically given to really assessing your financial constraints or your financial freedom relative to a new relationship. But I think it's important that you understand what you can afford in a service provider. I mean, you know what you're getting into the school, right, through your state aid and through all the financials. You know what you have as a fund balance. You know what you're paying to your existing vendor. You should know, based on all of that, then what you can afford in a new vendor. And I think what you really want to consider here is if you have any outstanding financial obligations under your existing agreement with an existing vendor, you're going to need to consider those financial obligations into the budget for any new vendor, right? Because that's going to impact your financials as you're currently looking at them and at this stage of the process. So just all of those financial implications. What's the timeline? This is where you're going to want to lay out from beginning to end. What's this project going to look like from a timing perspective? And then when we get a little bit later into the process, I'm going to show you a sample timeline that you can consider. Do we need a committee? Do we need to establish some kind of subcommittee from the board to really head this up? And my response to that would be yes, that you might want to consider establishing a committee that can do some of the work, some of the legwork for you. Obviously, especially in a full ESP transition, the full board is going to need to get involved. But if a committee can help with some of the elements, without violating any Open Meetings Act requirements, then use a committee for that. And then here you're going to want to establish any screening criteria and review process for really reviewing those applications, if you will, or those proposal responses. So that's the project planning phase. I apologize I just got a message that says the audio keeps cutting in and out. I hope that's not the case with all of you, but I apologize for that. We're getting, I'm in mid to northern Michigan, so we're getting a lot of rain and some interesting weather here. So that might be impacting some of the audio. So I do apologize. I hope you're getting enough of the information that it's helpful. So I apologize for that. So again, that project planning, that's phase one of our new process. Phase two of the process, as you'll recall, is going to be drafting the RFP. And we're going to call it an RFP because we're really, again, using that ESP transition as sort of our foundation. That's what we're thinking about here. So we're going to draft the RFP. And under that, there are some sections of an RFP that you're going to want to consider. And I've listed those for you. But I'm also going to take you now to a sample RFP document. And just like the communications plan, we're going to walk through that just briefly. It's a little bit more lengthy than the communications plan, so I don't want to take a lot of time in going through all of the components with you. So let me just share the first page of this RFP is your process details, right? So when are the responses due? When will the board notify the vendors? When will the interviews take place, et cetera, et cetera. Now, right here, I suggest, you might feel differently, but I suggest that particularly in a situation where the board is terminating an existing contract with a vendor before the contract expiration, that you emphasize that front and center to the RFP. So, for example, this language states here, the Academy, this is a reauthorization situation. The Academy will be engaged in reauthorization proceedings with this authorizer during whatever that period looks like. The Academy Board's existing contract expires on blank. And all of those details regarding the negotiated agreement. So the initial agreement will be negotiated. This is the language I wanted to point out. The initial agreement will be negotiated for a 1-year term to coincide with the remaining term of the charter contract. So you see what's happening here. Let's say you had an ESP with an agreement that expires with the charter contract on June 30th, 2020, right? But what you're saying is we're ending the relationship 1 year prior to that termination date. However, the new contract can't exceed the term of the charter contract. So that's why we can only enter into this agreement initially for a 1-year period. So I think if there's any extraordinary scenarios like that, again, in the spirit of openness and transparency, I would include that in the RFP language. So that's what that gets to. So I'm going to advance to page 3, and this is where you're just going to give some general introductory background language, operation details, who's the school, who governs it, when's the current charter contract expire, what are the grades, and a little bit about the existing vendor details, the mission, vision, general service desire details of the new relationship. So that gets to the second paragraph where it says the board believes a vendor model that has proven to be successful in serving a diverse population of students, allowing for maximum decision making at the academy level, will best serve its student population. So that's sample language. You can adjust that however you deem appropriate when the timing is right. And then this is just RFP submission details. By when, to whom, what's the date. One thing I want to point out here is this language. Questions regarding this RFP must be submitted in writing or via email by 5 p.m. on a certain date. So what this provides for is some of that timing where you're not fielding questions the entire time, but that it's formal as the process itself and that you're requesting formality to any questions regarding the RFP itself. So I think that's important language to include. And then finally, the next section is getting into the questions, the requests for information. So I'm not going to, again, highlight all of those questions by any means, because what we're going to talk about next, within the next couple of slides, are question guidelines. So you're going to use the RFP responses to help inform follow-up questions. So you'll have this with you during that face-to-face interview with a candidate, and you can refer to it accordingly. I will point out one question that I added to this template recently that I think it's important. If you have a strategic plan in place, and if you've outlined strategic goals, I think it would be in the board's best interest to identify those strategic goals in the proposal and then ask the respondent to mock up a report to the board on how they share progress in each of those goals. So just an exercise that I think is an important part of the response if indeed you have a strategic plan with strategic goals in place. So I added that recently. I do a lot of strategic planning with boards, as you know, so obviously that question is typically at the forefront of my mind. So just an RFP template for you to think about at the necessary time. And the template includes most of these items. Doesn't necessarily include budget material, but you're going to know that number and you're going to have some hopefully follow-up conversation, particularly when you get into a face-to-face situation with the applicant about the finances at the right time. So that's drafting the RFP. Now we're going to issue the RFP. Pretty simple process. You're going to distribute to your networks. Remember, you identified your range of vendors a little while ago. So you're going to distribute your RFP to those vendors. The coordinated responses and answers to questions you've identified in the RFP itself. We just talked about that with how those are to be submitted and by the certain, deadline dates that you articulate. And then you're going to receive submissions within the time frame that you've identified in the RFP. So that's the issuing phase of the process. And finally, you're going to review the proposals and you're going to award the contract. So you're going to review the proposals, you're going to score the proposals. Remember, we talked about identifying, when we plan the project, remember we talked about identifying the scoring criteria and the rubric. So now you're going to score those proposals based on those outcomes. You're going to select your finalists for interview. You're going to complete your interviews and reference checks. So let me just, I want to bring this up. And I think, again, this is important to me because I've been in a few situations where boards have been entertained by ESP candidates at a board meeting, and it ends up being the ESP candidate really sharing all of the details about it with the board, which, don't get me wrong, that's a really important part of the exchange, but I think the board also has a responsibility to use its time to ask wise questions, right, of the candidate. So here are just some guidelines relative to what kinds of questions you might want to consider asking. I didn't list out the questions. I just wanted to share with you some thoughts relative to the questions. So you see what those look like. I think one of the questions I want to point out of the question guidelines is this one. I think it's really important that when you have an ESP candidate before you, that you discuss or address any questions of capacity. So you've asked the capacity question in the RFP, but you still want to understand how adding a new school to the portfolio of the schools that this particular candidate manages is going to affect the resources that they're able to bring to you. So if you have a company that employs 3 employees and they're looking at adding a 15th school, that should be a pretty important conversation for you because you want exemplary services. And if you feel you're not going to get exemplary services because the capacity isn't where you believe it should be, then that is going to be helpful in informing your final decision making. Now, I'm not saying capacity is an issue. I'm not saying, oh, every vendor candidate needs X amount of employees to provide the kind of service that you deserve. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that you engage in a conversation that provides you with reasonable assurances that they have the capacity to deliver based on what your needs are, what your requirements are. So I think a good follow-up conversation for the board and the candidate to engage in. I think, I say here in this arrow, you might want to offer a scenario or mini case study that gets to communication. We all know that communication can really damage this kind of relationship. So, and it's usually what the board perceives a lack thereof that causes the challenge. So use this time to really help build confidence that your candidate understands how it is to communicate with you. And feel free to articulate your desires in that regard. It's never too early to talk about how you want to communicate effectively with a potential vendor. So don't hesitate to talk about that at this time, at this early stage of the relationship. And then I think just you can, again, I'll email this to you, or if it's going to be posted on the website, you can access it as well. But if you certainly want anything prior to the time it's posted on LSU's website, don't hesitate to ask for it. So that's just the interview question guide. And then finally, you're going to notify your finalists and say, hey, we'd like to we're choosing you. You're going to begin meeting then and negotiating that contract, that new contract, whatever that might look like. And then you're going to enter into final negotiations. So final negotiations, I think, requires a little bit of thoughtfulness relative to timing. So here's a timeline that you can consider when you're looking at making this transition. So all the way from process timing all the way down to new vendor boards, schedule meetings, forums with staff and school community. So I think all the really critical components for you to think about, and then you're going to get into services agreement negotiations when you're going to begin. It's going to be an iterative process because this is where you're going to get your authorizer involved, right? LSSU is going to want to review those agreements at various stages. So again, you need to provide for the timing of that relative to the timeline you establish in the project planning phase. So again, just a timeline as you look at these services transitions to use and to follow in your work. So that completes the process. So we looked at project planning, we looked at drafting the RFP, issuing the RFP, reviewing the proposals, and rewarding the contract. Oh, and then finally, you're going to want to notify other applicants as well of your decision to choose the finalist. And obviously, if there's anything else specific to this phase of the process that LSSU as your authorizer would like to see or has mandated, you need to stay in communication with them with respect to it. But I think we've covered all the key pieces of that final phase of the process for you. So that really takes us through all of our best practices. And let me just quickly review them again with you before you have the opportunity to look at them again on LSSU's website. But remember, best practice number one, understanding your contracts and your agreements, and that's all of them, right? Best practice then number two is ensuring that open communication from the time you're sensing some challenges in the relationship till the time that you transition services to a new vendor, open communication. Best practice number three, performing that needs analysis so you understand the service, the gaps, and what the new requirements should look like in a new relationship. Best practice then number four is developing or reviewing the process, which we just talked about as best practice number five, which is implementing the process with fidelity. So those are what I believe to be the top five best practices as you're looking at services transitions. And again, I'll emphasize any service transition. I know I emphasize the ESP relationship and understand that partly why I emphasize that so greatly is because that is a really, really critical relationship, and it deserves the kind of thoughtful time that I think this kind of process affords it. So please understand that. So let me just end our session tonight with some concluding thoughts relative to what we talked about. So I call them noteworthy items, right? We talked a little bit about this, but it's worth mentioning again. If you are transitioning management services, be mindful of your authorizer policies with respect to the RFP oh, goodness, I'm sorry. Let me go back to that. With respect to the process and or negotiated agreements. If transitioning management, be mindful of need to allow public to ask questions or comment on new management and public meetings. So we didn't spend a lot of time talking about this because this sort of gets into some operational pieces that would probably be best communicated with your authorizer. But there is a requirement that when you're ready to agree or finalize or adopt a new agreement, that you identify on your agenda at the meeting where it's going to be adopted an opportunity for public input of that agreement and or that transition change. So again, I'm making a note of it here. If you ever get to the point where you need further detail with respect to Lake State's position on that, then don't hesitate to ask that question. But just know that that's something that you're going to want to consider. Keep authorizer engaged in process as much as authorizer desires, and ensure mutual understanding of expectations with new vendors. So again, as you're looking at transitioning services with whatever kind of vendor you have, make sure you have a conversation around your expectations. What do you expect from this vendor as the board? And what does the vendor expect from you, right? I mean, that works in both directions. So engage in that mutual conversation and engage early and often, as they say. And again, just as we talked about previously, to the extent that you can and that it's necessary, include those expectations in any executed agreement. If it's an attachment, an appendices, whatever you need to do to get those expectations formalized through that formal agreement. So again, I thank you. We're 7 minutes early ending, so let me just, again, pause for a minute, give you an opportunity to ask questions. And again, if the audio wasn't 100%, I apologize for that. But again, hopefully you got the essence of the conversation. So I will just sit back for a minute and wait for questions, comments, thoughts to be shared. And again, this isn't the last time. So if you have any follow-up questions that you want to run by me, don't hesitate to ask. Oh, one might have come in. Oh, just a thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being such wonderful participants, for joining in on these webinars, this series. It's been a privilege to deliver this critical topic to you, and I just so very much look forward to future webinars where we can engage in further professional development. So thank you. Be safe. I'm glad all of you survived Winter Storm Jaden last week, and I hope the weather is looking up your way for the remainder of the week. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and don't hesitate to email me with any questions, with anything you'd like to be provided as a result of this evening's webinar. So thank you. Thank again, Lake Superior State University, for the opportunity to bring these webinars to you. So take care all and have a wonderful rest of your evening.